The California sun beat down on the firing range at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton with the kind of relentless heat that made sweat bead instantly on exposed skin. Lieutenant Kira Vance stood in line behind 17 other Marines, her boots planted firm in the dust, her rifle slung across her back with the casual ease of someone who had carried one for far longer than her personnel file suggested. The weapon felt lighter than it should have, worn smooth in places where her hands knew every groove, every catch, every imperfection that made it uniquely hers. Around her, the other Marines shifted and joked, their voices carrying that particular blend of bravado and nervous energy that always preceded qualification day. Staff Sergeant Derek Cullimore walked the line with his clipboard, his jaw working overtime on a piece of gum that snapped with metronomic precision. He was new to the unit, transferred in from 29 Palms just 3 weeks prior, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his reputation preceded him. Kira watched him approach with the same quiet attention she gave everything, her hazel eyes tracking his movement without seeming to focus on anything in particular. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest tactical advantage a person could possess. Staff Sergeant Cullimore stopped in front of her, his eyes sliding down from her face to her name tape and back up again. His mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile on someone else, but looked more like a smirk on him. "You ready for this, Vance?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and found it amusing. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," she replied, her voice level and unremarkable. He nodded slowly, that smirk deepening. Good. We need everyone to qualify today. No exceptions." His eyes flicked to the Marines on either side of her, both men who stood a head taller and carried an extra 30 pounds of muscle. "Can't have anyone holding up the unit, you understand. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have military bases near you, or perhaps you have served yourself and know exactly what this kind of moment feels like." Kira understood perfectly. She had understood for the better part of a decade, through 6 deployments and more firefights than she could count, through missions that would never appear in any official record and operations that existed only in the classified memories of the few who survived them. She understood that Staff Sergeant Cullimore saw a woman of average height and unremarkable build, someone who looked more suited to pushing papers than pushing downrange. "Understood, Staff Sergeant," she said. He moved on, and the Marine next to her, Corporal Marcus Thorne, leaned slightly in her direction. "Don't let him get to you," he muttered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Guy's been like that with everyone he thinks might make him look bad." Kira appreciated the gesture, though she did not need it. She had dealt with Derek Cullimore's before, in a dozen different uniforms and 100 different situations. They were always the same, these men who measured worth in inches and pounds, who saw the world through the narrow lens of their own assumptions. What they never saw, what they could never see, was the weight she carried that had nothing to do with muscle mass. The weight of 3 confirmed kills at distances that should have been impossible. The weight of a call sign she could never speak aloud in company like this. The weight of teammates who had bled out in her arms while she whispered promises she could not keep. The range safety officer called them forward, and Kira moved with the others toward the firing line. The rifle range stretched out before them, targets positioned at various distances, heat shimmer making the air dance above the dirt. Standard qualification: 300 yards, 200, 100. Prone, kneeling, standing. 24 rounds total to prove you belonged here, to prove you could be trusted with the weapon you carried every day. Kira took her position at lane 7, third from the left, and began her routine. Check the chamber. Check the magazine. Settle the rifle into the pocket of her shoulder, where it had lived for so many years it felt like part of her skeleton. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding every motion while her mind drifted to other ranges, other targets, other moments when 3 trigger pulls had changed everything. The command to commence firing crackled across the range, and 17 rifles barked in near unison. Kira squeezed her trigger with the same measured pressure she had used 1,000 times before, feeling the familiar kick against her shoulder, watching the target downrange through her scope as the round found its mark. Center mass. Exactly where it needed to be. Staff Sergeant Cullimore walked behind the line, his boots crunching in the gravel, stopping occasionally to observe a Marine's form or mutter something into his radio. When he reached Kira's position, he lingered longer than necessary, watching her cycle through her magazine with mechanical precision. Each shot landed true, each motion economical and unremarkable in its efficiency. "Not bad, Vance," he said, loud enough for the Marines on either side to hear. "Almost like you have done this before." Corporal Jonas Brennick, 2 lanes down, snorted. "That's what happens when you actually pay attention in training, Staff Sergeant. Unlike some people who think they are too cool for the fundamentals." Cullimore's head swiveled toward Brennick, his expression hardening. "You got something to say, Corporal?" Brennick shrugged, loading his next magazine. "Just saying the LT shoots clean. Better than half the guys out here." The staff sergeant's jaw worked his gum harder. "Clean does not mean combat ready," he said, his eyes sliding back to Kira. "Range day is one thing. Downrange is another. Some people fold when it matters." Kira said nothing. She had learned that silence was often the best response to provocation, that words rarely changed minds already made up. Instead, she focused on her breathing, on the rhythm of inhale and exhale that steadied her heart rate and cleared her mind. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down like a physical weight, and sweat traced lines down her temples that she ignored with the same discipline she ignored everything else that did not matter. The qualification continued through the morning, moving from 300 yards to 200, from prone to kneeling positions. Kira maintained her performance. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would draw attention beyond Staff Sergeant Cullimore's apparent need to make an example of someone. She scored well within acceptable parameters, good enough to pass without standing out, average enough to remain invisible. That was the game she had played for 8 months now, ever since she had rotated back stateside and been assigned to this training unit as part of her cover assignment. 8 months of pretending to be ordinary, of letting her skills atrophy just enough to seem believable, of watching her periphery for the shadows that sometimes followed people with her particular skill set. The morning qualification ended, and the Marines cleared their weapons and secured their gear. Kira performed her post-firing ritual with the same methodical care, cleaning her rifle with practice strokes, inspecting each component with the kind of attention that spoke of deep familiarity. Her fingers found a small imperfection in the barrel rifling, a catch she had memorized years ago, and something in her chest tightened with recognition. This was not her issued weapon. This was her weapon. The one that had been with her through Helmand Province and the Hindu Kush, through operations that had no names and targets that officially did not exist. Someone had made sure she received it. Someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had been. Lunch break was called, and the Marines dispersed toward the chow hall, their voices rising in the particular relief that came with passing qualification. Kira remained at her station, finishing her cleaning, taking her time because rushing would look wrong, and she had learned to never look wrong. Staff Sergeant Cullimore approached again, his shadow falling across her workspace. "You know, Vance," he said, his tone conversational, but carrying an edge underneath. "I looked at your file last night. Pretty thin for someone who has been in as long as you have." Kira continued cleaning, her hands steady. "I go where they send me, Staff Sergeant." He nodded slowly. "Right, where they send you. Lots of redacted sections in there. Lots of blanks. Makes a person wonder what you have been doing all this time." "Training, mostly," she replied. "Same as everyone else." Cullimore crouched down beside her, bringing his face level with hers. His breath smelled like spearmint gum and coffee. "See, I do not buy that. I think there is more to you than you let on. I think maybe you have been coasting on some special treatment, some diversity quota nonsense that lets average performers slide by on politics instead of merit." Kira met his eyes for the first time since he had started talking. They were blue and cold and absolutely certain of their own conclusions. She saw in them what she had seen in so many others, that fundamental inability to conceive of capability outside their own narrow definitions. "I qualified, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly. Same standards as everyone else. He stood, brushing dust from his knee. This afternoon, we are running a special exercise. Long distance. Real challenge. I want to see what you are really made of, Lieutenant. No more hiding behind average scores. His smile was sharp. Time to see if you belong here, or if you have just been lucky. The afternoon heat shimmered across the extended range with an intensity that made the distant targets waver like mirages. Kira stood with the other Marines who had volunteered, or been volunteered, for Staff Sergeant Cullimore's special exercise. The range stretched out to 800 yards, far beyond the standard qualification distance, and the targets had been positioned in challenging locations that required compensation for wind, elevation, and the brutal California sun that played tricks with perception. Cullimore stood before the group of 12 Marines, his hands on his hips, his expression smug with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to prove a point. "All right, listen up," he called out. "This is not your standard range day. This is about seeing who among you has what it takes to be a real shooter, who has the skill, the discipline, the raw talent that separates the pretenders from the legitimate operators." He paced in front of them, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. 800 yards. 3 shots. You will be shooting at steel silhouettes in varying positions. Wind is gusting 12 to 15 from the southwest. Temperature is affecting your ballistics. This is the kind of shot that separates people who can handle a weapon from people who just carry one. Kira felt the eyes of several Marines slide toward her, some curious, others sympathetic, a few openly anticipating her failure. She kept her gaze forward, her expression neutral, her hands relaxed at her sides. Inside, something old and familiar stirred, a muscle memory that went deeper than technique, deeper than training, all the way down to the part of her that had been forged in places where missing meant dying, and dying meant your team died with you. Corporal Thorne leaned slightly toward her. "This is garbage," he muttered under his breath. "He is setting people up to fail just to stroke his own ego." Kira appreciated the solidarity, but did not respond. She was watching Cullimore's body language, reading the tells that showed he had already decided who he wanted to see fail and who he wanted to succeed. His attention kept drifting back to her, with the focused intensity of a predator that had selected its prey. "We will go in order of rank," Cullimore announced, "which means Lieutenant Vance gets to show us how it is done first." His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Show us what that officer training bought us. LT, show us why you are leading Marines instead of following them." The other Marines shifted uncomfortably. Sergeant Elena Kozlowski, a veteran with 2 deployments under her belt, shook her head slightly. "This is not right," she said quietly, though not quietly enough. Cullimore spun toward her. "You have something to contribute, Sergeant?" Kozlowski straightened. "Just saying this is not standard procedure, Staff Sergeant. This kind of long-range shooting requires specific training and preparation. Setting someone up without proper spotting and preparation is not testing skill. It is testing luck." The Staff Sergeant's expression darkened. "I decide what is standard procedure on my range, Sergeant, and I decide what tests skill. Unless you would like to volunteer to go first instead?" Kozlowski fell silent, her jaw tight with frustration. Kira caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. It was fine. This was always how it went with men like Cullimore. They needed to prove something, needed to establish dominance through public humiliation. What they never understood was that humiliation only worked if the target cared about their opinion. Kira stepped forward, moving toward the firing position with the same unhurried pace she brought to everything. She could feel the weight of attention on her back. Here, the whispered conversations that probably included words like impossible and unfair and setup. They were right, of course. This was a setup, but they had no idea what they were actually watching. She reached the firing line and looked downrange. 800 yards. The targets were barely visible to the naked eye, heat distortion making them dance and blur. Wind flags along the range showed the gust Cullimore had mentioned, inconsistent and tricky. The sun angle was harsh, creating shadows and glare that would make acquisition difficult. Standard qualification used spotters and preparation time. This exercise offered neither. Just the rifle, and 3 rounds to prove whatever Cullimore thought needed proving. She settled into position, prone on the hot dirt, feeling the ground beneath her like an old friend. The rifle came up naturally, fitting into the hollow of her shoulder where it had lived for so many years. Her breathing slowed automatically, her heart rate dropping into that zone where everything else faded except the target and the wind and the tiny calculations happening in the back of her mind without conscious thought. Staff Sergeant Cullimore stood to her right, close enough that she could hear him breathing. "Whenever you are ready, Lieutenant," he said, his tone making it clear he expected her to fail spectacularly. "Take your time, or do not. Does not matter much at this range without proper training." Kira closed her eyes for just a moment, shutting out his voice, shutting out the watching Marines, shutting out everything except the feel of the weapon and the whisper of wind across her skin. When she opened them again, the world had narrowed to a single point of focus 800 yards away. The crosshairs settled over the distant target, and for a moment Kira was not on a California firing range anymore. She was back in the mountains of Afghanistan, the thin air burning her lungs, her spotter beside her whispering wind calculations while insurgents moved through a valley below. She was in Syria, on a rooftop that still smelled like burnt concrete and copper, her finger steady on the trigger while a high-value target stepped in her sight picture for exactly 3 seconds before disappearing forever. She was 23 years old again, fresh out of sniper school, being pulled aside by a colonel whose name she never learned and told that she had a gift, that the Marine Corps had special use for gifts like hers, that if she was willing to do things that would never appear in any citation or record, she could save lives that would never know they had been saved. The weight of memory pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. 3 years of missions that did not exist. 3 years of being a ghost in places where ghosts were the only things keeping worse things at bay. 3 years of perfect shots and imperfect outcomes, of targets eliminated and teammates lost, of coming home to a country that would never know what she had done in a military that could never officially acknowledge it. Her spotter in those days had been a Marine named Vincent Aldrich, a kid from Montana with eyes like flint and a dark sense of humor that kept them both sane when sanity felt like a luxury they could not afford. He had been with her on 17 missions, had called wind and distance while she made shots that should not have been possible, had dragged her out of a compound in Kandahar when everything went wrong and the extraction bird was 3 minutes late, and 3 minutes felt like 3 years. Vincent had died on Mission 18, not from enemy fire, not from an IED or a rocket or any of the 100 ways combat could kill you. He had died because a vehicle rollover on a supply route happened at exactly the wrong moment, because physics and bad luck intersected in a way that no amount of training or skill could prevent. She had been stateside when it happened, grounded with an injury that was healing wrong, and the news had come through official channels that never mentioned his real work, never acknowledged what he had actually been doing or why it mattered. After that, they had paired her with other spotters, but it was never the same. The shots were still perfect, the missions still successful, but something had shifted in her that made the work feel different. Made it feel like she was using up something finite, burning through some reserve that would eventually run out. Then came the mission that ended it all. A target in a city whose name was still classified. A shot from a building that was technically in friendly territory, but felt anything but friendly. The intelligence had been solid. The target was confirmed. Everything had been planned with the usual meticulous precision. But intelligence is only as good as the moment it describes, and moments change faster than bullets fly. She had taken a shot. Center mass. Perfect execution. The target dropped exactly as intended. And then the building next to the target exploded, a secondary blast that nobody had predicted because nobody had known there were explosives stored there. 12 civilians died in that explosion. 12 people who had nothing to do with the target or the mission or the war that was not officially a war. The investigation cleared her. The intelligence failure was documented. The mission was classified even more deeply than before. But Kira knew what she knew. Her bullet had not killed those 12 people, but her bullet had started the sequence that led to their deaths. Perfect shot, imperfect outcome. The math of war reduced to its most brutal equation. They had offered her a choice after that. Continue the work, accept that collateral damage was part of the calculation, trust that the targets she eliminated were worth the cost. Or step back, take a rotation stateside, work in training where her skills could be used to prepare others without putting her finger on the trigger. She had chosen the latter. 8 months of teaching Marines how to shoot, how to breathe, how to make the calculations that might one day save their lives or in someone else's. 8 months of being ordinary, of letting her file gather dust and redactions, of pretending that Lieutenant Kira Vance was just another officer working her way through a career with no particular distinction. But the rifle in her hands remembered. Her body remembered. And somewhere deep in the machinery of the military that had made her into what she was, someone remembered too. Someone who had made sure she received this specific weapon today, this rifle that had been with her through operations that never happened and shots that were never recorded. Someone who wanted her to remember what she was capable of, or perhaps wanted to remind her of what she could never truly leave behind. The wind shifted slightly, a gust that would push the round left if she did not compensate. Kira made the adjustment without thinking, muscle memory taking over, her body responding to data her conscious mind had not yet processed. 800 yards in these conditions with no spotter and no preparation was not impossible. It was just improbable. And she had built a career on making the improbable look routine. Staff Sergeant Cullimore shifted his weight beside her, impatient. You planning to shoot today, Lieutenant? Or should we move on to someone who actually knows what they are doing? Kira exhaled slowly, letting the breath carry away the memories and the weight and everything except the simple mechanics of what came next. Her finger found the trigger with the familiarity of long practice. The trigger broke clean, the way it always did when everything aligned. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with familiar authority, and Kira rode the recoil naturally, keeping her sight picture steady, watching through the scope as the round traveled downrange through heat shimmer and wind gust and 800 yards of California air that wanted to push it off course. The steel target rang out a moment later, the sound reaching them delayed by distance, a clear metallic note that cut through the afternoon heat. Perfect center mass. No hesitation, no adjustment, just a shot landing exactly where it needed to be, as if she had walked up and placed it there by hand. Behind her, the watching Marines went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. Staff Sergeant Cullimore stood frozen for a moment, his expression cycling through surprise and suspicion before settling on something harder and less readable. Lucky shot, he said finally, his voice loud enough to carry to the other Marines. Wind must have pushed it right into target. Happens sometimes. Sergeant Kozlowski made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disbelief. Staff Sergeant, that was center mass from 800 yards with no spotter and no prep time. That was not luck. Cullimore's jaw worked his gum harder. One shot proves nothing, Sergeant. Anyone can get lucky once. He turned to Kira, who had already cycled the bolt and chambered the second round. Let us see if the lieutenant can do it again. In fact, let us make it interesting. He walked downrange toward the target markers, pulling his radio from his belt. The other Marines watched him go, confusion mixing with growing tension. Corporal Thorne moved closer to Kira, his voice low. What is he doing? Kira said nothing. She was watching Cullimore's body language, reading the stiffness in his shoulders and the aggressive set of his stride. He was a man whose worldview had just been challenged, and men like that rarely responded with grace. They escalated. They doubled down. They needed to reassert control by any means necessary. Cullimore spoke into his radio, terse commands that Kira could not quite hear. A moment later, one of the range workers drove out in a utility vehicle carrying additional target stands. They began repositioning targets at Cullimore's direction, moving them at angles that would make wind compensation more difficult, placing them in positions where heat shimmer would obscure sight lines. Corporal Jonas Brennick shook his head. This is insane. He is changing the exercise parameters midstream. That is not testing skill. That is just being petty. Testing skill is exactly what this is, Cullimore called back as he walked toward them, having heard Brennick's comment. Real-world shooting is not about perfect conditions. It is about adapting to whatever the situation demands. If the lieutenant is half as good as some people seem to think, then she should be able to handle a little extra challenge. He reached the firing line and pointed downrange where the workers had just finished repositioning. New target at 700 yards, 11 o'clock from your position, partially obscured by that berm. Wind is crossing at an angle now. Make the shot, Lieutenant. Show us that first one was not just beginner's luck. Kira shifted her position, acquiring the new target through her scope. Cullimore was right about one thing. This was harder. The angle meant she had to compensate for both wind and the diagonal trajectory. The berm created a tunnel effect that could push the round unpredictably, and the target was smaller than the first, a silhouette that presented maybe 60% of a normal target profile. She made the calculations automatically, factors clicking into place without conscious thought. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, angle of fire, rotation of the Earth at this latitude. All of it processed in the span of seconds by a mind that had done these calculations under far worse conditions while people were actively trying to kill her. Behind her, she heard more Marines gathering. Word had spread during lunch that something interesting was happening on the extended range. She recognized voices from other platoons, heard the whispered conversations speculating about what was going on. The audience was growing, which meant the stakes were growing, which meant Cullimore would only become more invested in seeing her fail. The scope settled on the target. Partial profile. Wind crossing. 700 yards. Not the hardest shot she had ever made. Not by a long margin, but hard enough that failure would be expected and forgiveness would be instant. No one would blame her for missing this. No one except the part of her that had never missed when it mattered, that could not miss when lives depended on it, that had been trained and refined and sharpened until missing was not a physical possibility. Her breathing slowed. Her heart rate dropped. The world narrowed again to that singular focus that had kept her alive through 3 years of classified operations. She felt the wind against her left cheek, felt the earth beneath her body, felt the rifle become an extension of her will rather than a separate object. Staff Sergeant Cullimore crouched beside her again, close enough that she could smell his breath. You know what I think, Vance? I think you have been coasting on reputation you do not deserve. I think those redactions in your file are not protecting classified operations. I think they are covering up mediocrity that someone decided to promote anyway because of politics. Kira said nothing. Words were distractions, and distractions led to mistakes, and mistakes at this distance meant proving him right. She focused on the target, on the calculations, on the simple mechanical truth that bullets followed physics and physics did not care about anyone's opinions. Take your shot, Lieutenant, Cullimore said, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. Or admit you cannot make it, and we can all stop pretending. The second trigger pull was smoother than the first, if such a thing was possible. Kira felt the break point with absolute certainty, felt the firing pin strike home, felt the bullet leave the barrel with the inevitability of gravity. She tracked it through the scope, even though human eyes could not actually see a bullet in flight, tracking instead the path she knew it would take, because her body understood trajectory the way other people understood breathing. The steel rang again. Clean hit. Center mass on a partial profile at 700 yards with crossing wind and no preparation. The sound echoed across the range with a finality that silenced every conversation, every whispered speculation, every doubt that had been voiced in the growing crowd of observers. Staff Sergeant Cullimore stood slowly, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for any single one to take hold. He stared downrange at the target, then at Kira, then back at the target, as if the steel silhouette might have moved itself into the path of her bullet. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. That was, he started and stopped. His gum had gone still in his mouth. That was a difficult shot. Sergeant Kozlowski stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly. That was an exceptional shot, Staff Sergeant. That was the kind of shooting that requires extensive training and real-world experience. The kind of shooting that does not happen by accident twice in a row. The Marines who had gathered were murmuring now, the sound building like distant thunder. Kira could hear fragments of their conversations, questions about who she was and where she had trained and how someone could make shots like that look effortless. She remained in position, her eyes still to the scope, her body still locked in that perfect shooter's stance that had been drilled into her until it became more natural than standing upright. Corporal Thorne moved closer to Cullimore, his expression somewhere between impressed and vindicated. Staff Sergeant, I think maybe the lieutenant's file is redacted for good reason. I think maybe she has done things we do not have clearance to know about. Cullimore's face darkened. 2 shots do not make someone special operations, Corporal. They make someone a decent shooter who got lucky with conditions. He turned to face the gathered Marines, raising his voice. You all want to be impressed by standard marksmanship? This is what you are supposed to be able to do. This is baseline competency, not some miraculous achievement. But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him. Kira saw the uncertainty there, the creeping realization that he had miscalculated something fundamental. She had seen that look before on the faces of men who suddenly understood they were standing next to someone whose capabilities exceeded their comprehension. All right, Cullimore said, his voice taking on a harder edge. One more shot. Final test. He pulled his radio again, barking orders that sent the range worker scrambling. This time he walked out himself, personally supervising the placement of a new target. This is getting ridiculous, Corporal Brennick said to no one in particular. He's just making himself look worse. Captain Raymond Lattimore emerged from the crowd of observers, his expression thoughtful and concerned. The captain was old guard Marine, 26 years of service, 3 wars, and the kind of quiet authority that came from having seen everything twice. He approached Cullimore as the staff sergeant returned from placing the target. Derek, Captain Lattimore said, his tone conversational but carrying weight. What exactly are you trying to prove here? Cullimore straightened, suddenly aware that his actions were being observed by someone who outranked him significantly. Sir, I am simply conducting a comprehensive evaluation of marksmanship capabilities. The lieutenant volunteered for extended range training. The captain looked at Kira, still in position, still waiting with that preternatural stillness that marked real shooters. Did she volunteer? Or did you volunteer her? The distinction seemed to hang in the air between them. Cullimore's jaw worked. I selected her for this exercise based on her qualification performance this morning, sir. Captain Lattimore nodded slowly. And what was her qualification score? Perfect, sir. But that does not necessarily indicate, Cullimore started. Perfect, the captain repeated. And you decided that someone who shot perfect needed additional testing. He turned to look downrange at where Cullimore had positioned the 3rd target. What am I looking at here, Staff Sergeant? 900 yards, sir, Cullimore replied, his voice defensive now. Elevated position on that hillside. Wind is variable at that distance, probably 15 to 20 gusting. Target is partially concealed by vegetation. It is a legitimate challenge for any shooter. It is a legitimate challenge for a trained sniper, Captain Lattimore said quietly. Which makes me wonder what you know about Lieutenant Vance that the rest of us do not. The question landed like a depth charge in still water. The watching Marines went quiet again, sensing that something important had just shifted in the conversation. Kira felt the weight of attention pressing down on her back, felt the moment crystallizing into something that would become story, something that people would remember and retell. Staff Sergeant Cullimore's face had gone red. I do not know anything, sir. I just think that anyone who claims to be competent should be able to prove it under real conditions. 900 yards is not a real condition for infantry Marines, the captain said. 900 yards is specialist work. He paused, his eyes moving between Cullimore and Kira. Unless you are testing for something specific. Unless you already suspect Lieutenant Vance has capabilities beyond standard infantry training. The silence stretched. Kira could hear her own heartbeat, steady and slow, could feel the rifle against her shoulder like an old friend waiting patiently. She knew what was happening. The game was changing. The fiction she had maintained for 8 months was developing cracks, and through those cracks, light was beginning to show. Kira made the adjustments for 900 yards without conscious thought, her hands moving across the scope with the efficiency of long practice. The target was barely visible even through magnification, a dark shape against the hillside that could have been anything from this distance. The vegetation Cullimore had mentioned created irregular patterns that broke up the silhouette, making target acquisition more about knowing where to look than actually seeing what was there. The wind at 900 yards was not just a single factor to calculate. It was a living thing that changed character as it traveled, pushing harder in the open spaces, eddying around terrain features, accelerating and decelerating in ways that required intuition as much as mathematics. She felt it against her skin, read it in the way the sparse grass bent and recovered, understood it the way she understood the rifle in her hands. Captain Lattimore moved to stand beside her, his presence a stark contrast to Cullimore's aggressive hovering. He had not crouched down or invaded her space. He simply stood at a respectful distance and observed, his weathered face thoughtful. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I served with a sniper team in Fallujah," he said quietly. "Scout sniper platoon attached to 1st Battalion 8th Marines. I watched those men and women make impossible shots look routine. Watched them calculate factors that I could not even perceive, compensate for variables I did not know existed." He paused. "You move like they moved, Lieutenant. You breathe like they breathed." Kira said nothing, her eyes still pressed to the scope, her focus unwavering. But something in her chest tightened at his words, at the recognition from someone who actually understood what he was seeing. "The thing about those snipers," Captain Lattimore continued, "was that they never showed off, never made noise about what they could do. They just did their jobs quietly, efficiently, and when the shooting was over they cleaned their weapons and moved on to the next mission. They did not need anyone's validation because they knew exactly what they were worth." His words hung in the air between them, an offer of understanding, perhaps even protection. Kira felt the weight of his presence shift slightly, felt him turn to face the watching crowd. "Staff Sergeant Cullimore," the captain said, his voice carrying authority now. "I am calling this exercise complete. The lieutenant has demonstrated more than adequate marksmanship capability." Cullimore's face flushed darker. "Sir, with respect, we have not completed the full evaluation. One more shot at distance would provide valuable data about performance under maximum stress conditions." "Maximum stress," Captain Lattimore repeated. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, what is stressful about shooting at a steel target on a California range with no enemy fire, no time constraints, and no lives depending on the outcome?" The question silenced Cullimore completely. His mouth worked, but no sound emerged. Around them, the gathered Marines shifted uncomfortably, sensing the rebuke even if it had been delivered with measured calm. But Kira had already made her decision. She had let 8 months pass in careful anonymity, had hidden what she was because hiding had seemed like the path that led away from the person she had been. But hiding required cooperation from the world, and the world had just decided to stop cooperating. Staff Sergeant Cullimore had forced this moment with his ego and his need to humiliate, and now the moment existed and could not be unmade. She could walk away. Captain Lattimore had given her that option, had tried to protect whatever cover she still maintained. But walking away meant letting Cullimore's narrative stand, meant allowing doubt to linger about whether she had just gotten lucky twice, meant accepting that her capabilities would always be questioned by people who could not conceive of them. "Permission to complete the exercise, sir," she said quietly, her first words since settling into position. Captain Lattimore looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "You do not have to prove anything, Lieutenant." "I know, sir," she replied, "but I'm going anyway." The captain nodded slowly, stepping back. "Your call, Lieutenant Vance." Kira returned her attention to the scope, to the distant target that wavered in heat, shimmer, and wind. 900 yards. No spotter. No preparation. Variables that changed moment to moment. It was hard, genuinely hard, the kind of shot that required everything she had learned and everything she was to make successfully. But hard was relative. Hard compared to what? Hard compared to shooting a high-value target from a rooftop while mortars fell around her position. Hard compared to taking a shot with wounded teammates bleeding out behind her. Hard compared to knowing that missing meant people died, and success meant living with what success cost. This was just steel and distance in physics. This was a problem with a solution, and she had solved harder problems in worse conditions while carrying heavier weights. The rifle steadied in her hands with the certainty of absolute familiarity. Her breathing fell into the rhythm that had sustained her through operations she could never speak about. Her finger found the trigger with the muscle memory of 3 years spent becoming something more than human and less than whole. The watching Marines had gone silent again, the kind of silence that came from witnessing something that existed outside normal experience. Even Staff Sergeant Cullimore had stopped moving, stopped chewing his gum, stopped radiating his aggressive certainty. He stood frozen like everyone else, watching a woman make a shot that should not be possible, that required training and experience and capability that her file claimed she did not have. Kira exhaled slowly, letting the breath carry away the last whisper of doubt, the final echo of hesitation. The world contracted to a point 900 yards away, and her finger began its inexorable press against the trigger that would change everything. The third shot broke with the same clean precision as the first two, the rifle kicking back against her shoulder with familiar authority. Time seemed to stretch as the round traveled downrange. 900 yards of California air and heat shimmer and variable wind. Every yard a test of calculation and compensation and a kind of muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought. The steel rang out. Clean hit. Perfect center mass on a target that most Marines would have struggled to see clearly, let alone hit with precision. The sound echoed across the range and then kept echoing in the stunned silence that followed, as if the world itself needed a moment to process what had just happened. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The watching Marines stood frozen in various attitudes of shock and disbelief, their faces reflecting the fundamental recalibration happening in their understanding of who Lieutenant Kira Vance actually was. Staff Sergeant Cullimore looked like someone had struck him physically, his expression cycling through denial and anger and something that might have been fear. Then Sergeant Kozlowski started clapping. Slow, deliberate, the sound sharp and clear in the silence. One by one, other Marines joined her, the applause building until it filled the range with genuine appreciation and awe. They were not clapping for a lucky shot or a decent performance. They were clapping for something they had never seen before, something that existed in a category beyond their previous experience. Captain Lattimore moved closer to Kira, who had finally risen from her shooting position, her movements economical and unhurried. The captain's face was thoughtful, his eyes holding a knowledge that went deeper than the moment. 3 for 3 at extended range with no preparation, he said quietly. Wind compensation, elevation adjustment, heat shimmer mitigation. That is not standard infantry training, Lieutenant. That is not even standard Marine Corps Scout sniper training. Kira met his eyes, seeing in them the recognition she had been avoiding for 8 months. No, sir, she replied. It is not. The captain nodded slowly. How many deployments did you actually have before they put you here? 6, sir. Kira's voice was steady, carrying no pride or regret, just the simple statement of fact. And the work you did on those deployments, the work that is redacted in your file, that was Scout Sniper Platoon? Kira hesitated for just a moment, then shook her head fractionally. No, sir. It was more specialized than that. Understanding dawned in Captain Lattimore's eyes, the kind of understanding that came from 26 years of service and enough clearance to know what existed in the shadows beyond normal military operations. He opened his mouth to say something else, then stopped as movement caught his attention from the parking area adjacent to the range. A black SUV with government plates was pulling up, dust rising behind its tires. Kira felt her stomach tighten as she watched it approach. She recognized that vehicle, or ones like it, from the days when her missions had begun with anonymous pickups and ended with debriefs in rooms that officially did not exist. The timing was not coincidental. Someone had been monitoring this range, watching this exercise, waiting for exactly this moment. The SUV stopped, and 2 men emerged, both wearing civilian clothes that screamed military even without the uniforms. The first was a lieutenant colonel, his bearing unmistakable despite the polo shirt and khakis. The second was older, 60s maybe, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of service in places that tested men to their breaking points. He wore aviator sunglasses that hid his eyes, but Kira knew those shoulders, that walk, that presence. Admiral Kellen Thrace, Naval Special Warfare Command, one of the highest-ranking SEAL officers in the United States military, and a man who had personally authorized her last 3 missions before she had requested rotation stateside. He had been the voice on the radio during her worst firefight, the authority who had signed off on operations that pushed every boundary of acceptable risk, the commander who had attended Vincent Aldrich's funeral and told her personally that she had not failed him. The crowd of Marines parted automatically as Admiral Thrace and the lieutenant colonel approached. Even without knowing who he was, they responded to the sheer authority he carried, the weight of command that needed no announcement or introduction. Staff Sergeant Cullimore stood straighter, his face going pale as he realized that whatever was happening had just escalated far beyond anything he had anticipated. Admiral Thrace stopped 10 feet from Kira, removing his sunglasses to reveal pale blue eyes that had witnessed things most people could not imagine. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile on someone less controlled. "Lieutenant Vance," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent range. "I heard you were putting on a demonstration today. Thought I might drive up from San Diego to watch." He glanced at the distant targets, then back at her. 3 for 3 at extended range. Not bad for someone who's been out of the game for 8 months. Kira stood at attention, though he had not commanded it. "Sir." Admiral Thrace walked closer, stopping just within conversational distance. His eyes moved to the rifle she still held, recognizing it the same way she had recognized it. "That is a long way from home," he said quietly. "Someone must have thought you needed it back." "Yes, sir," she replied, understanding the implication. Someone in Naval Special Warfare Command had arranged for her classified mission rifle to appear at this training exercise, had known or perhaps orchestrated this entire situation to force her capabilities into the open. The Admiral turned to address the gathered Marines, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone instinctively pay attention. "For those of you who do not know me, I am Admiral Kellen Thrace, Naval Special Warfare Command. I am here because Lieutenant Vance served under my command for 3 years, conducting operations that remain classified at the highest levels." The weight of Admiral Thrace's words settled over the range like a physical presence. The Marines stood motionless, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion to dawning comprehension. Even Captain Lattimore, who had suspected something, looked stunned by the confirmation that Lieutenant Vance had been operating at levels most Marines would never reach. Staff Sergeant Cullimore had gone from pale to ashen. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. He looked like a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time, every assumption he had made about Kira Vance revealed as catastrophically wrong. Admiral Thrace continued, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had delivered countless briefings to audiences far more hostile than this one. "During her time under my command, Lieutenant Vance conducted 43 classified operations across 7 countries. She is credited with neutralizing high-value targets that represented imminent threats to American forces and Allied personnel. Her work saved lives, many lives, more than any of you will ever know." He paused, letting that information sink in, watching the faces of the Marines as they processed what it meant. 43 operations was not a casual number. That was years of sustained high-level work, the kind of operational tempo that broke most people long before they reached that count. The Admiral's eyes found Cullimore, and something cold entered his expression. "I understand, Staff Sergeant, that you questioned Lieutenant Vance's qualifications today, that you suggested she had been promoted based on politics rather than merit, that you designed this exercise specifically to expose what you believe to be inadequacy." Cullimore's face flushed red. "Sir, I did not know. I did not have access to her classified record. I was just trying to maintain training standards." "Training standards," Admiral Thrace repeated, his tone suggesting he found the phrase amusing in a way that was not at all pleasant. Tell me, Staff Sergeant, what are your qualifications? How many deployments have you completed? For Sir, Cullimore replied, his voice tight. 2 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. And your combat experience? Any direct action? Any specialized training beyond standard infantry? The silence that followed was answer enough. Cullimore had been a good Marine by conventional standards, but he existed in a completely different category than the woman he had been attempting to humiliate. The gulf between them was not about gender or politics or any of the factors he had assumed mattered. It was about capability refined to a level he could not comprehend. Lieutenant Vance, the Admiral said, turning back to Kira, has forgotten more about combat shooting than most Marines will ever learn. She has made shots under conditions that would terrify experienced snipers. She has operated alone in hostile territory where capture meant death and failure meant American casualties. She has earned every decoration she cannot wear and every commendation that cannot appear in her public record. He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to a level that only she and the nearest Marines could hear. She also requested rotation stateside after a mission that went sideways in ways that were not her fault, but which she took responsibility for anyway. Because that is what good operators do. They carry the weight of their decisions even when the outcomes were beyond their control. Kira met his eyes, seeing in them the understanding of someone who knew exactly what she had been carrying for 8 months. The 12 civilians. The secondary explosion. The perfect shot that had led to imperfect consequences. He had been there for the debrief, had seen the reports, had made the decision to grant her request for stateside duty, even though it meant losing one of his most effective operators. But the thing about warriors like Lieutenant Vance, Admiral Thrace said, raising his voice again to address the full crowd, is that you cannot take the warrior out of them by changing their location. You can rotate them stateside. You can put them in training units. You can redact their files and tell them to keep their capabilities hidden. But when the moment comes, when someone challenges them or questions their worth, or creates a situation that demands their true skill, the warrior emerges. Because capability like hers is not something you turn on and off. It is who you are at the deepest level. Sergeant Kozlowski spoke up, her voice respectful but curious. Sir, if you do not mind my asking, did Lieutenant Vance have a call sign during her classified operations? The Admiral smiled, a genuine expression that softened his weathered features. She did, Sergeant, though I suspect she would prefer it remain classified along with everything else. But Kira knew the moment had passed for that kind of secrecy. The fiction of ordinary Lieutenant Vance had been shattered by 3 perfect shots and the arrival of a SEAL Admiral on a Marine Corps range. Whatever had been hidden was now exposed, and trying to maintain the pretense would only make things worse. Iron Widow, she said quietly. My call sign was Iron Widow. The name hung in the air like smoke, and several of the older Marines reacted visibly. Corporal Thorne's eyes went wide. Holy shit, he breathed. I heard stories about Iron Widow. Operators in Afghanistan used to talk about a sniper who could make impossible shots, who showed up when things went wrong and fixed them with 3 rounds. I thought it was a legend, like a ghost story people told. Not a ghost, Admiral Thrace said. Very much real. And standing right here in front of you, having just demonstrated why that call sign was earned and why it stuck. Staff Sergeant Cullimore looked like he wanted to sink into the ground and disappear. His face had gone from red to gray, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if he could not bear to look at Kira directly. Whatever authority he had wielded on this range had evaporated completely, replaced by the crushing weight of having challenged someone so far beyond his level that comparison was meaningless. Captain Lattimore stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Admiral, with respect, if Lieutenant Vance is who you say she is, why is she here training basic Marines? Why is someone with her capabilities not still conducting operations? The Admiral looked at Kira, giving her the choice of whether to answer. She appreciated the courtesy, but she was done hiding, done pretending, done carrying the weight of secrecy that had become heavier than the weight of truth. Because I requested it, sir, Kira said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeper something that spoke to costs most people never had to calculate. After my last mission, I requested rotation stateside. Not because I could not do the work anymore, but because I needed to step back from it. Needed to remember what it felt like to be a Marine without carrying the weight of classified operations. Admiral Thrace nodded slowly, his expression understanding. The last mission was difficult, he said carefully, aware of the classified nature of what he could say in front of Marines without proper clearance. Intelligence failure led to unintended consequences. Lieutenant Vance executed her portion perfectly, but the outcome was not what anyone wanted. Unintended consequences. The phrase sounded so clinical, so distant from the reality of 12 bodies pulled from rubble, 12 families who would never know why their loved ones had been in that building at that moment. Kira felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the weight that never fully lifted no matter how many times she reminded herself that the mission had been cleared, that she had followed orders, that the intelligence failure was not her fault. But fault and responsibility were different things, and she had learned long ago that responsibility did not care about fault. She had pulled the trigger. The target had fallen. The explosion had followed. Those three facts existed in an unbreakable chain, and she lived at the center of that chain whether anyone blamed her or not. "How many did you lose?" Corporal Thorne asked quietly, then seemed to realize the inappropriateness of the question. "Sorry, Mom. That is not my business." Kira looked at him, seeing genuine concern rather than prurient curiosity. "One spotter," she said. "Vincent Aldrich. Vehicle accident during a supply run between missions. Not combat-related, which somehow made it worse. We had survived 42 operations together, and he died because of bad roads and worse luck." The Marines absorbed this in silence, understanding at least partially what it meant to lose a teammate, to survive when others did not. Combat created bonds that civilians could not fully comprehend, and the loss of those bonds left scars that never completely healed. Admiral Thrace cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Vance has been here 8 months working in training capacity, helping prepare Marines for deployment. From what I understand, her instruction has been exemplary. She has been teaching fundamentals, basic marksmanship, standard qualification procedures, all well below her actual capability level." Way below, Sergeant Kozlowski said, a note of awe still in her voice. "Sir, I have watched the lieutenant run qualifications for 6 months. She always shot well, but never like this. Never anything that would make you think she was special operations. She hit perfectly." "Because that was the agreement," Admiral Thrace replied. Lieutenant Vance requested assignment where she could contribute without being in the spotlight, where she could step back from high-stakes operations and remember what normal military service looked like. We honored that request because she had earned the right to choose her own path forward. He turned to face Kira directly, his expression serious. "But I will be honest with you, Lieutenant. We have been monitoring your situation. We knew about Staff Sergeant Cullimore's attitude. We knew he was going to push you eventually. And we made sure you had access to your primary weapon today, because we suspected this moment was coming." Kira felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. "You set this up," she said, not quite a question. "We did not set up Cullimore's behavior," the Admiral replied. "That was all him. But we did make sure you had the tools to respond when that behavior inevitably escalated. Because the truth is, Lieutenant, we need you back. Not in training. Not hiding your capabilities. We need Iron Widow operational again." The words hit like a physical impact. Kira had known this was coming, had felt it building since the moment her old rifle had appeared in the armory, but hearing it stated plainly still sent a jolt through her system. "No, sir," she said. "I made my choice 8 months ago. That has not changed." Admiral Thrace studied her for a long moment. "The situation has changed, though, has it not? You just demonstrated in front of 50 Marines that you are something beyond their understanding. The fiction of ordinary Lieutenant Vance is gone. You cannot go back to quiet obscurity after this." He was right, and Kira knew it. Word would spread. Stories would circulate. Iron Widow would become more than a whispered legend, would become attached to her name and her face in ways that would make normal service impossible. She had known this the moment she decided to take that third shot had understood that choosing to reveal her capability meant accepting the consequences of revelation. "I am not asking you to decide today," the Admiral continued. "I am asking you to consider that you did not end up here by accident. You requested stateside duty to heal, to process what happened, to find some equilibrium. But healing does not mean hiding. And equilibrium does not mean denying what you are. What I am," Kira said quietly, "is tired, sir. Tired of making shots that kill people. Tired of operating in shadows where success is measured in bodies and failure is measured in American casualties. Tired of carrying secrets that weigh more than any gear I ever loaded." The Admiral nodded slowly. "I understand that, Lieutenant. I genuinely do. But I also know that people like you, operators with your level of capability, do not get to choose comfortable retirements. The world does not work that way. Threats do not pause because you need time to heal. And capability like yours is too rare, too valuable, to be wasted on basic training ranges." Staff Sergeant Cullimore, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. "Sir, I need to apologize. To the Lieutenant. To everyone. I made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice. I questioned her qualifications when I should have been learning from her. I have no excuse." The apology hung in the air, sincere but inadequate, an acknowledgement of error that could not undo the damage already done. Kira looked at him, seeing not an enemy, but a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when people let their assumptions blind them to reality. "Your apology is noted, Staff Sergeant," Kira said, her voice neither forgiving nor condemning. "But understand that this is not about you making assumptions about me. This is about the assumptions you make about every Marine who does not fit your narrow definition of capable. How many others have you underestimated? How many have you dismissed or discouraged because they did not match what you expected competence to look like?" Cullimore's face reddened again, but this time with shame rather than anger. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally nodded. "You are right, ma'am. This is bigger than just today. I will do better." "See that you do," Captain Lattimore said, his tone making it clear that Cullimore's future would be closely monitored. "Because this is not just about Lieutenant Vance. This is about every Marine in this command who deserves to be judged on their actual capabilities rather than your preconceptions." Admiral Thrace glanced at his watch, then back at Kira. "I need to return to San Diego, but before I go, I want to say something publicly." He raised his voice to address all the assembled Marines. "What you witnessed here today is not just exceptional marksmanship. It is the result of years of training, sacrifice, and service at the highest levels. Lieutenant Vance earned her call sign through 43 missions where failure was not an option and success often meant making impossible shots under impossible conditions." He paused, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the crowd. "Some of you will leave here today and tell stories about Iron Widow. You will talk about the 3 shots at extended range, about the Marine who turned out to be a legend. That is fine. That is natural. But I want you to remember something else too. Remember that Lieutenant Vance chose to step back from that life. Chose to spend 8 months teaching basic Marines fundamentals instead of conducting high-risk operations. That choice takes a different kind of courage than pulling a trigger." The words settled over the range with unexpected weight. Kira felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that someone understood not just what she had been, but what she had been trying to become. The Admiral caught her eye and gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that passed between them without need for words. "Lieutenant," Admiral Thrace said, turning to face her directly, "you have my number. When you're ready to talk about coming back, call me. Until then, you have my respect and my support for whatever path you choose." He extended his hand. Kira took it, feeling the firm grip of someone who had commanded warriors for decades and understood the cost of what he asked of them. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. The Admiral and the Lieutenant Colonel returned to their vehicle, and within moments they were gone, leaving behind a range full of Marines trying to process what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Sergeant Kozlowski spoke up. "So, ma'am," she said, a hint of humor in her voice, "does this mean we can stop pretending you need basic marksmanship instruction?" A few Marines laughed, the sound breaking the tension. Kira felt herself smile slightly, the first genuine expression of anything like amusement she had shown all day. "I suppose the secret is out, Sergeant." Corporal Thorne stepped forward, his expression serious but respectful. "Ma'am, I know this probably sounds stupid after everything, but would you be willing to teach us? Not basic qualifications. Real techniques. The things that made you Iron Widow. Most of us are headed to deployment in 6 months, and learning from someone with your experience could save our lives." Kira looked at him, then at the other Marines who were nodding agreement. They were not asking out of idle curiosity or desire for bragging rights. They were asking because they understood that war was real and dangerous, and that learning from someone who had survived it repeatedly might be the difference between coming home and not coming home. "I'm not sure what I'm authorized to teach," she said carefully. "A lot of my training involved classified techniques and equipment." Captain Lattimore spoke up. "I can work on getting the appropriate clearances and permissions. If you're willing to teach, Lieutenant, I will make sure we do it properly and legally. Your experience is too valuable to waste." Kira considered this. Teaching was different from operating. Teaching meant passing on knowledge without having to use it herself, meant preparing others without bearing the weight of the trigger pull. It was a way of contributing that might allow her to maintain some distance from the sharp end of combat while still serving a purpose. "All right," she said slowly. "If we can get the clearances, I will teach what I am allowed to teach. But we do it right. No shortcuts, no half measures. If I am going to train you, you're going to learn properly." The Marines responded with visible enthusiasm, several nodding or murmuring agreement. Even Staff Sergeant Cullimore looked relieved, as if being offered a chance to learn from her represented some path toward redemption for his earlier behavior. "One condition, though," Kira added. "This stays professional. I am not interested in becoming a celebrity or a story people tell at the bar. I am a Marine doing a job, same as all of you. What happened today stays on this range." "Understood, ma'am," Corporal Thorne said, and the other Marines echoed the sentiment. Captain Lattimore gestured toward the headquarters building. "Lieutenant Vance, walk with me. We need to discuss how this is going to work going forward." Staff Sergeant Cullimore, secure the range and dismiss the Marines. "I think we have all had enough excitement for one day." Cullimore saluted crisply. "Yes, sir." Kira followed the captain toward the parking area, the rifle still slung across her back, feeling lighter somehow despite the weight of what had just occurred. The fiction of ordinary Lieutenant Vance was gone, burned away by 3 perfect shots and the arrival of an admiral who knew exactly who she was. But maybe that was not entirely a bad thing. Maybe hiding had been its own kind of burden, and revelation, however uncomfortable, represented a different path forward. The sun was lower now, the heat beginning to break as afternoon moved toward evening. Behind her, she heard the Marines talking in animated voices, processing what they had witnessed, probably already beginning to craft the stories they would tell despite her request for discretion. That was fine. Stories were how warriors made sense of things beyond normal understanding. She had been Iron Widow. She might be Iron Widow again someday. But for now, she was just Lieutenant Kira Vance, walking across a California firing range with a captain who was trying to figure out how to use her capabilities without breaking her in the process. 3 weeks later, Kira stood at the same extended range under a sky that threatened rain, watching 12 Marines settle into firing positions under her instruction. Captain Lattimore had worked miracles with the paperwork, securing limited clearances that allowed her to teach advanced techniques without compromising operational security. The Marines before her represented the most skilled shooters in the battalion, hands elected for deployment to regions where precision fire might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Corporal Thorne was among them, as was Sergeant Kozlowski. Even Staff Sergeant Cullimore had requested inclusion, his ego apparently salvaged enough to accept instruction from the woman he had tried to humiliate. Kira had approved his participation after a private conversation where he demonstrated genuine understanding of his failures and sincere commitment to improvement. Everyone deserved a chance at redemption if they were willing to do the work. Wind compensation is not just about reading flags, Kira said, her voice carrying clearly across the line. It is about feeling the wind against your skin, understanding how it changes with terrain and temperature, learning to trust your body's ability to process information your conscious mind has not yet calculated. You cannot teach this from a manual. You have to live it until it becomes instinct. She moved down the line, correcting grips and stances with the efficiency of someone who had learned from the best and refined those lessons through hard experience. The Marines responded to her instruction with focus and respect, understanding that they were receiving knowledge most shooters would never access. Word had spread through the battalion about what had happened 3 weeks ago, but the stories had taken on a reverent quality rather than sensational gossip. Iron Widow was teaching. That meant something. The morning passed in focused work, each Marine taking shots at progressively more difficult targets, while Kira provided real-time feedback and correction. She found herself slipping into the rhythm of instruction naturally, discovering that teaching carried its own satisfaction. Watching a Marine make a connection, seeing the moment when theory became practical understanding, felt like its own kind of victory without requiring anyone to die for it. By afternoon, the clouds had gathered but the rain held off, creating perfect conditions for long-range work. Kira set up a scenario at 700 yards, multiple targets at varying elevations, wind gusting unpredictably. The Marines worked in pairs, alternating between shooter and spotter, learning the communication and trust that made sniper teams effective. Staff Sergeant Cullimore surprised her by showing genuine aptitude. His shooting had always been technically sound, but now that he had shed his ego enough to actually learn, he demonstrated the kind of focus and discipline that made good shooters great. When he made a particularly difficult shot, compensating correctly for a sudden wind shift, Kira nodded approval. Well done, Staff Sergeant. You were starting to feel it instead of just calculating it. Cullimore smiled slightly, the expression lacking any of his previous arrogance. Thank you, ma'am. I am beginning to understand why your call sign meant something. This is not just about pulling a trigger. This is about becoming part of the weapon system. Exactly, Kira replied. The rifle is just a tool. The real weapon is the person behind it, and that weapon takes years to properly forge. As the afternoon wore on and the training session neared its end, Captain Lattimore appeared at the range with someone Kira had not expected to see again. Admiral Thrace emerged from the captain's vehicle, still in civilian clothes, his expression neutral, but his presence commanding immediate attention. The Marines straightened instinctively, recognizing authority even without understanding exactly who he was. Admiral, Kira said, moving to meet him. I was not expecting you, sir. Thrace smiled slightly. I wanted to see how the teaching was going, and to make you an offer in person rather than over the phone. Kira felt her stomach tighten. Sir, I thought we had an understanding. I am not ready to return to operations. The Admiral held up a hand. Not operations, Lieutenant. Training. We want to establish a formal advanced marksmanship program at Special Warfare Command. Something that brings together the best techniques from Marine Scout snipers, Army Rangers, SEAL teams, and classified programs like the one you came from. We want you to run it. The offer hung in the air between them. Kira processed the implications, understanding that this was different from what she had been doing. This would be official, structured, a permanent teaching position rather than temporary duty. It would mean leaving Camp Pendleton, leaving these Marines she had begun to invest in, but it would also mean doing work that mattered without having to operate downrange. You would have full authority over curriculum, Thrace continued. You would select your own assistant instructors. You would teach the teachers, train the trainers, pass on everything you learned so that the next generation does not have to figure it out the hard way. No more classified missions. No more trigger pulls. Just teaching people how to save lives by being better at their jobs. Kira looked back at the Marines on the range, saw them watching this exchange with curiosity and concern. She had spent 3 weeks with them and already felt the satisfaction of seeing their skills improve, their confidence grow, their understanding deepen. Imagine doing that full-time, creating a program that would touch hundreds or thousands of warriors over the years, spreading knowledge that had cost her so much to acquire. What about these Marines, sir? She asked, They deploy in 5 months. They need the full training cycle. Thrace nodded. You would finish their training first. We would not pull you until they ship out. After that, you would report to Coronado, and we would build the program from the ground up. Your program. Your way. It was the answer to a question she had not known how to ask. A way forward that honored what she had been without requiring her to be that person again. A path that let her contribute without bearing the weight of individual trigger pulls. A future that made sense of her past without being consumed by it. If this story moved you, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or tell us if you have witnessed someone reveal unexpected strength when the world doubted them. Share if you have seen courage emerge from the most unlikely places. I will need that in writing, sir, Kira said finally. Formal orders, clear parameters, guaranteed timeline. I am not committing to something based on verbal assurances. Admiral Thrace smiled broadly. You will have it by end of business tomorrow. Welcome back, Iron Widow. Not to the shadows this time. To the light where others can learn from you. He extended his hand, and Kira took it, feeling the weight of decisions settle into place with surprising comfort. She turned back to the Marines, who had been watching with barely contained curiosity, and raised her voice to address them. All right, everyone, we have 2 hours of daylight left, and I want to see each of you make a 700-yard shot with under 10-second target acquisition. Let's make it count. The Marines returned to their positions with renewed focus, and Kira moved among them offering guidance and correction, feeling for the first time in 8 months that she had found her place. Not in the darkness where she had operated for 3 years. Not in the hiding where she had spent the last 8 months. But here in the space between, teaching warriors to survive the wars that were coming while she herself survived the wars that had already been. The rifle across her back no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a tool, one she might never need to fire in anger again, but one whose lessons could still save lives through the hands of those she taught. Staff Sergeant Cullimore made his shot clean. Sergeant Kozlowski followed with equal precision. Corporal Thorne took his time, breathed correctly, and rang steel at 700 yards with the confidence of someone who was beginning to understand. And Kira Vance, formerly Iron Widow, watched them all and knew that this was enough. This mattered. This was worth doing. The shadows would always be there, and the weight of what she had done would never fully lift. But here in the light, teaching warriors to be better than they thought they could be, she had found something worth holding on to. The rain finally came as the sun set, a light drizzle that cleared the range and sent everyone toward shelter. Kira was the last to leave, standing alone with her rifle as water fell around her, washing away dust and heat and 3 weeks of uncertainty. Tomorrow she would continue training. In 5 months, she would say goodbye to these Marines and wish them luck downrange. And then she would go to Coronado and build something new from the pieces of who she had been. Iron Widow was not dead. She had simply evolved into something different, something that might matter more in the long run than any single shot ever could. And that, she thought as she finally turned towards shelter, was enough.